it's kind of interesting that they don't get it, isn't it? Of course, it's kind of interesting that we don't get it
as well,
too. Yeah.
Scary thought.
Chapter 11, I think, is an important one because it contains the discussion of the final stages of the Jaredite apostasy cycle. There's an interesting governmental provision that's added now at this point in history in verse 5. Terry, would you read verse 5 of chapter 11 for us and maybe make a comment about that?
It came to pass that the brother of Shiblon caused that all the prophets who prophesied of the destruction of the people should be put to death. So back in chapter 7 you have the government protecting prophets. By the time you get to chapter 11 you have the government executing prophets. And that leads right to the point where they reach a point of no return. From by the time you get to chapter 11 there are no more righteous kings. That's it, they're done.
And we get this again, the idea that we see the wicked destroying the wicked, one king overthrows another in quick succession. These are the most miserable of people, and it's the destruction of the Jaredite nation. Now, I think it's important to point out is that while the Jaredite nation is destroyed, there's still probably some righteous individuals. And one of those, not probably, there are righteous individuals, and one of those is introduced to us at the end of chapter 11, and he is not the king, but he works in tandem with the king, and that's the prophet Ether.
Now, do you think, as I understand this, if it had continued to follow along the dynasty, Ether would have had a claim to be the king?
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
But like other prophets, they chose to focus on the things of God. Haven't we seen that before in Alma, for example, where the prophet gives up the kingship, the governmental position, to focus on the prophetic calling?
What a hard job Ether had.
Yeah.
He had to witness and chronicle the destruction of his people and be left alone. I think Moroni probably identified with him. You know,
I think you're right.
He probably saw what Ether was going through and said, you know, Ether, I've been there, I've done that. I've had to do the very same thing. There must have been a
great comfort of him to know that someone else had been through that similar situation.
And it was either Jared or Terry that mentioned this probably prompted Moroni to jump in every once in a while and say, oh yeah, it reminds me of what I see going on in my own day. You know, you fast forward many centuries and you've got Moroni's circumstances, which parallel exactly the circumstances of Ether and others who were before him. What we learn about Ether is, to me, stunning. He is one of the great prophets of faith, and I think chapter 12 is one of the significant parallels to other chapters in the standard works on faith. I think of, for example, Hebrews chapter 11 in the New Testament, which talks about the nature of faith, but then provides us many examples of the results of possessing faith, and that's what we get in Ether chapter 12.
Moroni here, again, has to jump in and just, he saw that Ether taught so much about faith, and he had to say, now, let me talk about faith too. The kindred spirits that felt so strongly about that important principle of the gospel.
What is it about faith that strikes you that is so significant, brought out in chapter 12, that we might not get in other places in the standard works?
Well, I think one of the great principles of faith that makes faith even better than knowledge is faith leads to action. You can know something and you not do anything about it, but you have faith in something. I think that's actually superior. I tell my students all the time, listen, I don't know if there's an afterlife. The only way you can find out is to die. But I have great faith that there's an afterlife, and that impels me to live a good life here. An afterlife. I'm not saying I don't disbelieve there's an afterlife, but I have faith. And in my mind, faith is even more powerful and more important than knowledge.
Yeah, so the prophet Joseph was really right when he said faith is a principle of action. By faith, even the worlds were brought into existence. Of course, our Father in heaven has a different kind of faith than we have. His isn't dependent on anything, but ours is dependent on the Godhead and principles. What else about faith that's important, that's articulated in Ether chapter 12?
I think related to that in verse 6 is, this principle of you receive no witness until after the trial of your faith. I think this is probably the clearest place where that's outlined. And Moroni repeats that with all the examples that he then goes and he repeats that until after they had faith in him, until after. We want to see the sign first and then we want to take action.
Yeah.
But Moroni is pointing out that the spiritual path is opposite. You demonstrate the faith and then you will see the sign. And it's kind of related, when we look at trial of faith, it's not just a test of faith. The purpose of that, it's going through that, our faith is strengthened and revealed to us. We come to realize what faith we do have, going through the process of not having that answer right away that we wish we had. We come to realize, hey, you know what, I actually did have faith even without that answer.
So faith brings to us greater opportunities for personal revelation and significantly ministers to our education, which I think is a crucial point. Thank you.
I think another reason why faith comes before the miracle is because it takes faith to access the powers of heaven. Faith is a principle of power. Remember, Christ said there were certain things he couldn't do for the people in the old world that he did for the Nephites because they didn't have the faith. They couldn't access the power without faith. I often say faith is kind of like the gasoline in your car. It's what empowers your car. You can have the car, but if the tank's empty, you're not going anywhere. Yeah. And when you put it has to be real faith. If you put water in your tank, you're not going anywhere. But if you put something that has power in it, then you can access it.
So faith is things which are hoped for and not seen, but it has to be based on something that's true. If you base your belief on something that's false, it doesn't lead to anything. It's not faith. It's not the kind of faith that's talked about here.
There's quite a connection between faith and hope here as well.
He does.
Those two, to him, they're inseparable. And it's not like it's a process, one comes before the other, but you have to have both.
In fact, we ought to read a couple of verses. Let's go to verse 4. Terry, Brother Zink, would you read for us verse 4, and then Jared, would you read for us verse 6?
Okay. Wherefore, whoso believeth in a God might with a surety hope for a better world, yea, even a place at the right hand of God, which hope cometh of faith, making an anchor to the souls of men, which would make them sure and steadfast, always abounding in good works, being led to glorify God.
So this hope that cometh of faith, he's saying, makes an anchor for our souls.
Good image. Anchor to the soul.
An anchor to the soul. So faith and hope intricately tied together. Now, Jared, read verse 6 for us.
And now I, Moroni, would speak somewhat concerning these things. I would show unto the world that faith is things which are hoped for and not seen. Wherefore dispute not, because you see not, for you receive no witness until after the trial of your faith.
And so then you ask the question, well, what comes first, faith or hope? And Moroni would say, they're so intricately connected together that you really have a tough time teasing them apart. I know that sometimes we tried to make technical distinctions, but I think they work so closely in tandem that it's profitable for us to think of them in the same breath. Yeah.
I think Moroni gives a clue as to why that is so. Later in chapter 10 of Moroni, in verse 22, he kind of gives a definition of hope by default. He says in verse 22 of chapter 10 of Moroni, if you have no hope, you must needs be in despair. So despair is the opposite of hope.
Right.
And despair cometh because of iniquity, which would then make you think that hope comes because of righteousness.
Yeah.